Crysis 2 and 3 Remastered are releasing, and as always, I'm of course there to cover them on the PC platform. In today's video, I will be going over the many changes brought into Crysis 2 Remastered and those going into Crysis 3 Remastered by comparing them to the PC versions from 2011 and 2013 respectively at their highest settings, going over as much as I realistically can, and there's a lot to cover here. At the end of the video, I will briefly touch on performance, so you know what kind of hardware will be required to run these remastered games with their new enhanced visuals. There is a lot to talk about here, so let's dig right in, starting with Crysis 2 Remastered. One of the largest changes in Crysis 2 Remastered is the introduction of sparse voxel tracing for diffuse lighting, which then combines with hardware triangle tracing for specular lighting. That software ray tracing solution traces voxel representations of the scene geometry and bounces primarily diffuse lighting around the scene. So those indirect shadows from the sky, like you see here underneath this AC unit on the roof, or bounce lighting from the sun, like we can see here where the sunlight is hitting the floor below and scatters light very visibly onto the brick underside of the windowsill. Hardware ray tracing does the specular or view-dependent light, so in this scene it would be the metals on the gun or hand, or the subtle reflection of that sunlight hitting the ground on the brick here on the right-hand side. The original DX11 patch for Crysis 2 on PC had a few ways to simulate bounce lighting, the first of which was with cube maps, for a general coloring of the scene's diffuse and specular lighting. So here, in this scene, look at the area and shadow. That general blue color from the sky is there from the cube map. On top of this, the DX11 patch added screen space reflections, which you can see on the side of the ambulance here, which reflects the side of the yellow building to the left here in screen space. And Crysis 2 and DX11 was the first game, to my knowledge, to use screen space reflections. To round this all off, Crysis 2 on PC, and on PC exclusively, had light propagation volumes, which as you can see here, added in a low fidelity diffuse bounce of light from the sun, which is a bit exaggerated as you can see, and has a number of problems where it can leak through thin geometry. Like in this building here where the sunlight bouncing from the outside leaks through the thin side of the building. So how does this look in comparison to Crysis 2 Remastered's GI? For one, the bounce of light from the sun is much less extreme than in the original game here, as it's more fine-grained. Notice how this smaller sliver of light hitting the side of the building here is now bouncing light locally onto the building itself in that shadowed area. In the original, well, that's missing altogether. The new trace lighting's accuracy leads to some massive differences in nearly every scene in the game. Like here in the original release, in this alley rooftop here, we can see that typical blue glow from the cube maps here, and screen space ambient occlusion is in play, adding in contact shadows where geometry gets close to one another, like at the point where the wall meets the AC unit here. In the remastering, the lighting on the objects themselves now is not coming from a cube map primarily, but rather from the skylight and from sunlight hitting a building nearby. And instead of screen space ambient occlusion adding in these halos of darkness where geometry touches, there's actually an indirect shadow primarily from that skylighting being cast by the AC unit itself. So you have two things going on here: more accurate secondary shadowing from things like the sky, as well as colored bounce lighting typically coming from the sun. And this, like I said, leads to some massive differences. In the original game, nearly every single scene's shadowed areas are just this glowy gray and blue, where cube maps are causing this glowy color to apply to everything, and screen space ambient occlusion is trying to ground objects in that by creating halos of darkness around them. As you can see in side-by-sides, the remastered version remedies this look, preventing that odd glow that happens due to cube maps, and gives objects proper shadows depending upon where the sky is or where localized light is bouncing from. In general, this means a lot more realistic lighting, as well as an increase in general in scene contrast in a localized and realistic way based upon lighting direction or whether or not the big blue sky lighting can actually reach an area. I think the images say it much better than I can even describe it. For sure, Spooky is imperfect since it's based on voxels and can have minor light leaking, like you can see here in the corner of this building where a bit of that bounce light is leaking in from the outside, but even with such small deficiencies, it is far less prone to light leaking than the original light propagation volumes from Crysis 2 in 2011. As a part of this new lighting is specular lighting, which is done now by hardware ray tracing. So, ray traced reflections. One of the most obvious areas you can really see that, I think, is on glass with transparencies. Like here, where glass in the original has a static cube map, giving it a rather inaccurate reflection. While in Crysis 2 Remastered, the glass shows a real-time reflection of everything in that scene. Or like here, with this partially transparent puddle on the ground. The original puddles only support cube maps here, while in the new one, hardware ray tracing adds real-time reflections that look quite good. This tracing applies to transparencies for all water surfaces in the game, from water found inside fountains, as you see here, to water found inside flooded bathrooms, as you can see here, adding in localized reflections that match up with the scene lighting and geometry. In general, due to the voxel lighting and ray traced reflections, Crysis 2 Remastered greatly enhances one of the weaker parts of CryEngine around Crysis 2's release. Many engines at this time really could not realistically shade transparencies. Like you see here, glass would have sorting issues, where the sign in the front here has weird shading with the glass from the building behind it. And all the glass from that building behind it is almost like a pure white, lit completely differently than the rest of the scene. In the new version, the glass now is reflecting the area around it as well as being shaded by the ambient lighting in that area in a much more realistic fashion. And this applies to things like clear plastics as well in the game, or really any single time a transparency is used. As a part of this, transparencies in general in this PC version now are shaded in a much better way, and this applies to particle effects as well, where in the original, very few particle effects actually were affected by the scene lighting. Like you can see here in the background where the smoke billowing in the background is just like pure black. While in the new version, it seems to be affected by the sun lighting instead. And this applies to very many scenes in the game in the new version, where the new version of the engine essentially better shades particle effects based upon the environmental lighting. And this includes shadowing affecting the particles as well, which was added in the Crysis 2 DX11 patch back in the day, but only affected very few particle effects. And in the new version, affects nearly all of the particle effects. Transparency is not the only place where things have greatly changed, as the tracing in general greatly aids all scene objects. The new version enhances the appearance of metals, plastics, wood, stone, marble, and really anything, as Crysis 2's ray-traced specular applies to nearly all materials that even have the tiniest bit of specularity. Some materials are much more consistent this time around in the new version, looking like they should, and being shaded more like the material that they are trying to be, to the point where you can see a lot of small stuff going on in those materials due to the reflections, like your own character model is often reflected in the environment around you. Or you can see the red glow even of the nanosuit visor reflected on the back of your hands if you look hard enough. Given the amount of modern materials in Crysis 2's New York City, the ray-traced reflections here work wonders on top of the new diffused lighting done by Svogi, and this greatly enhances the visuals across the entire game in a much more dramatic fashion than the ray-traced reflections enhanced visuals in Crysis 1 Remastered. Now, a big reason why this is also the case is because Saber Interactive went in here and remade what appears to be thousands of the game's textures to be more physically correct, so the new lighting worked more consistently with them, as well as going back in and making sure the textures were generally higher res. Just as a simple example, look at this plaque here on the wall in the first level in both versions of the game. Now on the left, not only are the textures lower resolution, that's obvious enough to see, but the textures themselves were made differently, under a different paradigm, where a lot of detail was painted into the diffuse portion of the texture himself, instead of letting the game's materials and lighting system drive the look of a surface. This makes it so that detail on the left is heavily contrasted around the rock edges or where the bevels meet flat planes on the plaque. It looks very Xbox 360, I would say. On the right, though, the texture is much higher res, of course, but importantly, it was authored in such a way so that there's very little lighting information in the texture itself, and the shading is being driven by the material properties and lighting. So the stone wall and marble placard look very different in terms of material due to the way light is responding to them. This is where I will bring in comparisons to the amazing Maldo texture mod for the original Crysis 2 release. Here we can see how even though that Maldo texture mod has generally much higher resolution textures than the original release, that mod is still limited by the way textures were authored back at this time in the engine, as well as how the older version of the game is still using an antiquated lighting model. For example, here on this rooftop, The textures in the mod and the added shadows from the mod coming from the vegetation greatly outpace the original DX11 version for sure. But let's add in the remaster here, and we can see how the materials and texture resolution are in a league of their own, I think. And I think this shows off in general how important lighting and materials are to a game, much more so than texture resolution itself, as the way light is propagated around a scene or surface is far more important to that surface's realism than the resolution of the detail on the texture surface up close. While that mod's texture styling is outmoded and I would say outclassed by the remaster, that was not the only thing the mod did, as it did change level geometry and add in more tessellation in areas not found in either version of the game actually. So it can have some interesting advantages in a scene like this one here. But really, I think the lighting and materials of the remastered version far outweigh any other smaller advantages such a mod might have in terms of scattered objects. Alongside new materials and textures in the environment, the weapons in the game have also been generously retextured and enhanced. Like here in this scene, you can see how the pistol has a very different texture material in the new version, as well as a bit of depth of field on the back of the hands and on the weapon slide. The original DX11 version is actually missing this depth of field as it broke in that version of the engine. Similarly, weapons now have screen space shadows applied to them as well, as you can see here where the ridges of the mod rails on the Scarab have little shadows from the sunlight being cast from them, which are keenly missing in the original DX11 version. The biggest change to weapons though is not even in their rendering, but in their animation. The original Crysis 2, for some reason, on release, locked its weapon firing animations and other aspects of weapon animation to 30 FPS. Now, this is not very noticeable on all views and all weapons, but if you look at something like the shotgun, for example, well, I think it looks rather jarring, where each pump of that shotgun looks like it's stuttering. The new version fixes this, and I think simple side-by-side here, both at normal speed as well as slowing it down, show how much smoother those weapon animations are when they are matching your native frame rate. This improves the shooting in the game, which is definitely a very important facet of a first-person shooter. The last two larger changes in the game I think have been pretty obvious in the footage I've been showing here between the two versions. The first of which is the change in color post-processing. Crysis 2 in 2011 was chasing that Transformers J.J. Abrams look with extreme bloom and lens flares, super saturated colors with a blue-yellow tinge to nearly every scene. The post-processing also combined with the game's lighting tech and crushed blacks rather often. Honestly, I never liked Crysis 2's default color grading, even though I enjoyed other graphical aspects of the game. The new version of the game tones down the oversaturated crushed colors and bloom. This is visible in the very first cutscene. If I pause the frame, notice how all the shadowed areas in the original, with it lacking that local bounce light, is crushing to black. Or notice how the bloom is jacked up so high that the character's forehead essentially has a lens flare emanating from it. On top of this, the new game also altered the local lighting on some levels. Not the sun position or anything so extreme, but rather adding in some new lights of different intensity and color, often with more shadow casters. Or even just adding in and adjusting local lights for cutscenes to emphasize action in a different way. So far in the cutscenes I've seen, I would say generally these choices lead to a much better presentation overall. Now there are of course more changes to Crysis 2 Remastered here that I honestly don't have the time to mention, but some of the other tertiary upgrades are likewise shared by Crysis 3 Remastered. And Crysis 3 Remastered is a different and honestly simpler beast than Crysis 2 Remastered, and less work has been done to update the game. The primary reason I would imagine is because Crysis 3 was already an incredible looking game in 2013, and I would say it's aged very well in general, so it needs less work overall. The second reason is because some of the work that could have been done would have led to a spiral of work and redesign. Crysis 3 Remastered does not add in sparse voxel lighting for global illumination, but it does add in ray traced reflection support. And the reason I think there's no Sfogy in the game is because Crysis 3 used a very artist-driven global illumination approach. with artists adding in manual probe modifiers, as they were called, all across the levels on PC to darken and lighten areas. That gave the game the look it has. Ripping all that out and replacing it with something fully systemic like Sfogy might reveal that some areas are very implausibly lit, and level geometry might need to be changed actually to accommodate that. Either way, Sfogy's not there, but other upgrades there polish the experience for sure. The first of one is ray traced reflections. Ray traced reflections in Crysis 3 Remastered do very much the same as they do in Crysis 2 Remastered, improving the realism of materials and realism of the game's lighting model overall. Like here, notice how the vent goes from a dull gray, since screen space reflections do not work at this angle in the original, to actually showing the reflection of the vent surface in the remastering, thus transforming the way the material there looks. Similarly, look at how glass in this scene in the original has a rather low-resolution misaligned cube map. In the remastering, the glass appearance is upgraded with an accurate reflection of the environment adjacent to the glass surface. A nice upgrade, but these are the more obvious ways reflections tend to look in games. Crysis 3 is filled with a lot of organic surfaces and environments where typical understandings of reflections are not really present. Here, ray tracing helps by eliminating inaccurate cube map glowing and light leaking. A great way to show this off is in this vent here in the original 2013 release. Notice how in this vent, even though it's away from all the light sources in the level, the vent itself has a very intense ambient color. It's essentially glowing green-blue and receiving light that is coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Light is leaking through the geometry and affecting this vent unintentionally. With ray tracing on, specular light does not leak anymore to that extent, so the vent itself dramatically darkens like you would imagine it would be in a cramped vent, with the primary light shading the vent coming from light being reflected from the vent's opening outside. This is the effect you should imagine happening in many scenes in this game, like here with Psycho in the elevator. On the left, the original ambient light here is getting that cube map glow, so the elevator's internal area is kind of glowing and bright. With RT on in the remastering, the ambient specular light is only coming from inside the elevator, bouncing around in there. Thus, the glow coming from the outside is eliminated, and the scene gets a little bit darker. In outdoor natural scenes, this effect means less weird glow in shadowed regions, like here under the train tracks. Notice how in the original the grass here and the metal train tracks above have a lot of highlights on every single surface, regardless of where the sky lighting is actually touching them. These are typical QMAP inaccuracy problems. With RT reflections in the remastering, highlights on the grass are much more subdued, and the highlight on the train tracks is actually showing up where the sky lighting is managing to peek through, forming some interesting reflections and reflection shadows there. For water, ray traced reflections take a back seat in the PC version of Crysis 3 Remastered, and instead, Crytek implements full planar reflections in the PC version for the game's flat water surfaces. So in the original, where there were cube maps and screen space reflections, which would break obviously, reflections now stay on screen and reflect off-screen objects and the underside of objects, looking substantially better on average. Other pure graphical updates are few and far between in this Crysis 3 Remastered. For example, the grass now has a more accurate vegetation shading from later versions of CryEngine. Small, but appreciated upgrade. Bigger upgrades in general come to the game when it is in motion. First of all, like Crysis 2 Remastered, the game's anti-aliasing has been upgraded. Crysis 3 in the original, even with MSAA, mixing with state-of-the-art temporal AAs from back in the day, had a lot of aliasing in the game, specifically on shiny surfaces when you would move the camera side to side, backwards and forwards, and so forth. There was a lot of jagged edges there disappearing and highlights reappearing, causing flickering, even at 4K. Now with modern TAA or with DLSS as I'm showing here, the propensity to flicker and such is heavily reduced to the point where it does not happen anymore, essentially. Another upgrade is that water physics are no longer locked at 30 FPS. In the original, the water movement animations you would see here, for example, had the ripples on the surface and physics locked to 30, making them look a little bit framey. Now, in a side-by-side comparison slowed down, you can see how the remastered version is running at a full tick 60 here, making the water physics smoother. In general, this just means that firefights in and around the game's water, of which there are many in the game, tend to just look better as the water reacts to your shots or the enemy movements. Similarly, really upgraded are the game's grass physics, which ran at 30 FPS in the original game as well. In the new version, they run at 60, making the physics and wind forces applied to them animate more fluidly. But that's really about it. Some smaller tweaks to an already good-looking game. There may be a few amount of them, but they do make the game run a lot heavier on the GPU. The original game at its highest settings, with SMAA T2X at 4K on an RTX 3090 here, runs at nearly 100 FPS in this scene here. In the new version, there are planar reflections in this scene, so the scene becomes much heavier, dropping down to slightly below 60 FPS at 4K. If you turn on ray tracing on top of that to its lowest medium setting, that makes the GPU load even heavier, with the scene now running at 37 FPS. So Crysis 3 Remastered is a lot heavier on the GPU, and Crysis 2 Remastered will be, of course, as well. CPU-wise, the new game without RT actually ends up being faster. At a CPU-limited resolution for both versions of the game, over the course of the Fields Run benchmark, I saw Crysis 3 Remastered running 13% faster on average, particularly visible towards the end of the run. This in spite of the fact that grass simulation and more are now running at 2 times the rate. In terms of optimized settings for Crysis 3 and Crysis 2, my recommendations are different than usual. The whole point of a remastering effort, especially for the Crysis games, is about increasing visual fidelity. If you turn down a number of settings in the game, you'll end up having a graphical presentation in some aspects worse than the original games at max, which are now pretty easy to run these days. Given this situation, my recommendation here is actually to run the game at their highest settings without ray tracing to get the most out of the graphical enhancements in these remasters, as that's kind of the whole point of them. But with ray tracing, it's a question of your GPU and resolution. With this in mind, the RX 5700 and RTX 2060 Super do a most excellent job in this heavy area in the game in Crysis 2 Times Square as Ceph and Marines duke it out. Both GPUs are capable of playing the game very well at 1440p at very high settings, with the RTX 2060 Super managing to be around 9% faster here in this scene from this vantage point. With the ray tracing set to medium though, the story is quite different. The RTX 2060 Super drops down to below 60 FPS here at 1440p, while the RX 5700 is performing about as well as Crysis 2 on the PS3. This makes sense though, as the ray traced reflections in this game use hardware acceleration on the RTX card, while RDNA 1 card uses a software path that is inevitably much slower. Coming to Crysis 3, we can see in this scenario here how much heavier a game this is than Crysis 2 in general, even without Sfogy. Here, the RTX 2060 Super and 5700 at very high and 1440p are both below 60 FPS in this scene here, which honestly though is one of the heaviest scenes in the entire game. The RTX 2060 Super manages to be 11% faster on average, but not enough of course to put it near 60 FPS. With ray tracing on medium, things get serious, as Crysis 3 absolutely brutalizes both of these GPUs, with the 2060 Super just barely holding on to 30 FPS at 1440p, and the 5700 flatlining dead in the water, approaching performance near Star Fox on the Super Famicom. Based upon these tests, I have some general recommendations for both of these games that you can scale accordingly based upon your GPU's performance in comparison to these. An RTX 2060 Super has 2 recommendations. Play the game at 1440p native with no ray tracing if you wish, or I would say the better idea is to utilize ray tracing at medium, outputting at 4K, but utilizing DLSS in performance mode, so internally 1080p. On an RX 5700, just straight 1440p 60 at very high is an awesome experience. For Crysis 3, things are different. If you want to play at 1440p very high on an RTX 2060 Super level GPU, you're going to have to use DLSS in quality mode to get up to that 60 FPS level at 1440p. On the AMD side, 1080p will be the answer to your question. For ray tracing at medium, the RTX GPU should be looking to play at 1080p with DLSS in quality mode to start approaching that 60 FPS. With that being said though, I have to talk about 2 last subjects. On the ray tracing side, all ray tracing settings here offer up a good looking experience as I see it. In Crysis 2, it scales the resolution down with each setting, reduces the roughness cutoff, and on the lowest setting also gets rid of your character's self-reflection. In Crysis 3, it mainly just seems to reduce the resolution of the reflections. I honestly think the medium or performance setting looks good in both games, so don't be afraid to use it if you need more performance. For DLSS, I found DLSS to have higher quality on average in Crysis 2, mainly because that game has less cases where it can break. For example, in Crysis 3, the game has a lot more transparency in vegetation and views which stretch out for hundreds of meters or more. From what I can tell, the motion vectors in Crysis 3 are a bit finicky, especially after a certain distance. So in that game, DLSS quality suffers more, especially on the grass. As a result, for Crysis 3, I recommend a minimum of balance mode for those targeting 4K and quality mode for the resolutions under that at a minimum. And here I'm coming to the end of this long video covering Crysis 2 and 3 Remastered. I find the release of both of these games much more successful than Crysis 1 Remastered from last year, especially regarding Crysis 2, which I think looks really awesome graphically right now and is one of the better remasters I've played. It's allowing me to enjoy this game again, one that I actually didn't enjoy that much back in the day, and appreciate it anew all these years later. And that's what you really want out of a remaster. It's also a great demonstration of how important lighting is to video game graphics. Crysis 3 is slightly different. It was already an excellent looking game in 2013, so this remaster is just about adding a bit more polish onto that and allowing it to punish GPUs again with higher settings. There's some nice upgrades there for sure, but it's not reaching the heights of that second game's remaster. Now, both games do not ship with multiplayer modes from these titles, which is a shame for those of you who like them, but for me, I was always more interested in the single player in both of these games since they both did not have Crysis 1's Power Struggle game mode. Regarding the future of the trilogy, I think the last thing Crytek ought to consider is releasing the sandbox editor for all of the trilogy's games on PC, much like it did back in the day for Crysis 1 and 2. I know that's probably just a pipe dream at this point, but remasters are all about the community, and I think playing modded Crysis content over the next decade would be amazing. But that's all I can really say for now. If you did enjoy this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support DF on Patreon to get years worth of our content available in high quality for download. If you want to talk to me about Crysis 2 or 3 in their remastered form, write a comment below or follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. As always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und
the Alpha 7.